Hare Krishna, Jai Prabhupada. My first contact with God as a general person was when I was growing up as a child. I grew up between Mexico City and Paris, France, after having been born in Los Angeles. My father, my French father, used to work, was semi-retired, and so he was going back and forth between Mexico City and Paris. And my parents had or hired two nannies, or two ladies who took care of the house and so on, and who were also taking care of me as a baby. Now when my parents decided to sort of move permanently to Paris and spend much less time in Mexico, one of these nannies, Esther Gonzalez from Mexico, this indigenous Mexican lady, came with us to Paris. And so she continued taking care of me until I was 9 years old. Of course, living with my parents and so on, but she really took care of me, especially as a child. And she was a devout Catholic. She is. I still am in touch with her 40x years later. So she's a devout Catholic, and so she would take me to church. But more importantly, every night when she tucked me in to sleep, she would demand or request that I recite the famous Our Father prayer. And I couldn't go to sleep until I recited that prayer. And she taught it to me in Spanish, and I still have it ingrained, deep down, and I could recite it like this: Padre nuestro que estás en el cielo, santificado sea tu nombre, venga a nuestro reino, hágase Señor tu voluntad. Because I used to say, I wanted to sleep, right? So I would just like, hágase Señor tu voluntad así en la tierra como en el cielo, donde son nuestro pan de cada día, no nos des carentes, Señor, líbranos del mal, amén. So I would say amen, she'd be like, okay. And she would switch off the light and I could go to sleep. And so, I never really thought about it, but later on, in retrospect, I realized that this prayer did connect me, did instill in me a very strong sense of monotheism. Our Father, Krishna says, Sarvo, what is it? Aham bijak padak pita, sarvayoneshu konteya aham bijak padak pradak pita. I am the Father. So this idea of the Heavenly Father, or the Supreme Lord as the Father, was instilled in me, as a baby on a daily basis. So that was really my first. My mom was quite. My father was not very religious, although he grew up and educated by the Jesuits, the Jesuit order. He was French and white, Caucasian, but he grew up in Egypt because his parents used to work in Egypt. And in Egypt, in a French sort of community there in Alexandria, there were the Jesuits who were in charge of educating the kids. So he grew up with Jesuit teachings, but somehow he just never really connected, and he was more of an agnostic. But my mother, although she never went to church, was a theist and believed in God. And her mother, my grandmother, insisted that I get my first communion, and so for some months I went to catechism school and got my first communion and all that. But it was more like towards high school that I started really inquiring about the nature of reality, about life, about God. And because I had never really, unfortunately, come in contact with an inspiring Catholic priest. I'm not saying there are none, I'm sure there are, and I've met some since, but just I never clicked with that religious context in which I grew up. And I think that forced me to kind of look elsewhere, starting with Buddhism. In high school, I was in the honors section of our world civilization class in a high school in Santa Monica, Crossroads High School. And I had one professor with whom I'm also still in touch, Larry Morset, who, because I was in the honors section, it's a small class of about 10 students, he gave us extra books or extra readings to do, sort of an extra credit since we were in the honors section. And one of them was, he claims that it was passages from the Bhagavad Gita. I don't remember. I honestly don't remember. My first contact with the Bhagavad Gita came when I was in my first year of college at Cornell University, and I'll speak about that right away. But coming back to Crossroads, I did have this professor who had us read some passages from the famous Krishnamurti, some philosopher that I really don't respect very much now, in retrospect, with all due respect. But I guess the word Krishna wasn't there in his name. And Buddhist texts. So my first sort of leaning was towards Asian philosophies or Asian theologies was really through Buddhism. I had a friend in high school, Taft Green, who was this, really popular skater who knew how to surf. He was already a vegetarian. This is like early 1990s, late 1980s. It was still quite rare to find, vegan or vegetarian teenagers, 14-year-olds in America. But he was already a vegetarian, and he did Buddhist meditation, and I was like fascinated by his, can you teach me and stuff? And so on my own accord, I started buying some books, mostly by this guy called Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist who's based in France, actually. And so by reading his books, I really fell in love with the notion of self-control, of controlling the mind, of sort of being the objective observer of all the, the dualities of this world. The idea of reincarnation, intrigued me. But it was really when I went to Mexico. I used to go to Mexico every Christmas, even though we lived in France and back in America, in Los Angeles, where I was born originally. On the west coast of Mexico, pretty close to where we're filming this here in Guadalajara, is a place called Puerto Vallarta, and next to Puerto Vallarta is a place called Careyes, Playa Careyes. And my father, having worked and lived in Mexico before, had bought already long ago a beautiful little casita, a little house in this very sort of beautiful, exquisitely beautiful resort called Careyes, and we used to go there every Christmas. And the reason I mention this is because there was one lady, and she really played a very, very important role in my coming to Krishna consciousness. I mean, I really consider her, aside from Esther Gonzalez and my professor Larry Morissette, she was really Tari. Tari is her Sanskrit name, or Lorena Benvenuti, an Italian lady, married to a Mexican gentleman at the time. And she was really key in bringing me to Krishna, and I'll explain why. So ever since I was a kid, I would spend every Christmas in this Careyes resort, and she would be there because she lived there, and she ran a little store that sold Guatemalan textiles and silverware and stuff like that. And unlike many of the people who went to Careyes, who were quite sort of the superficial, ultra-rich type, she had a more of a shaman, white kind of dress with incense burning kind of lady, aura and persona. And we hit it off quite well, and so every year we'd always see each other, and so I mentioned her. Now, before I tell you about this trip which happened with her and which was key, I do have to mention that when I went to Cornell University for spring break, I flew back from New York, or from Ithaca, New York, to Los Angeles to visit my mom. I spent a few days there, and then when I was flying back to New York City, in the Los Angeles airport, which was kind of funny because little did I know that a year later, literally, I'd be spending the following subsequent 6 or 5 years in that airport, going every day to distribute Bhagavad Gitas to people who went through the LA airport. Suffice it to say that during that little, while I was waiting for my flight to go to New York, one devotee, I forget his name, I sort of put it together who it was. It may have been a disciple of Tamal Krishna Maharaj, living in Los Angeles, originally from Philippines, called Balaram Prabhu, because I sort of remember his face. He was Asian, and so this guy kind of approaches me before I'm about to board my flight and hands me a little thing that says, you've been caught, you're being verbalized, or you've been caught. And then there's some cartoon of some policeman, and there's 4 or 5 checks that and then one of them is smiling too much. It's like a sort of a gimmick. And so I was like, what? He gives me this, and he's like, no, I'm just kidding, sir. We're collecting, so he said we were collecting funds for something. And so he asked me for a donation. I said, okay. So I gave him a donation, and then he gave me a book, and that book was Message of Godhead, one of the early small essays that Prabhupada wrote in India before coming to New York, before he went on the Jaladuta, Message of Godhead, an essay on the 3rd chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So he gave me that book. I don't know if I would still recommend the same techniques of distributing books by asking for a donation for something. Maybe it was for prasadam distribution or something, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but I prefer just straightforward giving Prabhupada's books to people, even for free. I don't want to make a little side parenthesis here, but I am making it. Especially now that the books are online for free. For a brahmachari to ask for money for the books that they distribute to maintain their own livelihood, that's fine. But I think most of Devotees are householders, and therefore the notion of charity and giving free knowledge to people is a principle that I think we should put into action more, especially given that all of Prabhupada's books are already free online. Anyway, parentheses closed. This devotee gives me this book, Message of Godhead, and I went into the plane, I looked at it, I remember I came to Cornell, I went to my dorm room, and I opened the book, and I read one paragraph, I saw Prabhupada's picture for the first time, and I read how, Prabhupada used a lot of Sanskrit terms, which I had no idea of, so I couldn't follow, actually, to tell you the truth. So now back to Mexico. So after this first year of college at Cornell University, at the end of the school year, I asked my dad in France, can you please lend me the key? Can I go to Careyes alone and just take just 2 weeks off after, the semester is over to relax? And he says, yes. So I took a flight to Puerto Vallarta, and in Careyes, everything was arranged for me to have access to the casita. And it's, June is usually it's not very touristy because it's kind of rains. But this lady, my first sort of guru, Tari, or Lorena Benvenuti, happened to be there. And one day she saw me, she's like, what are you doing here? I'm so happy to see you. So she tells me, listen, I'm driving with my 2 kids. She had at that time like a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old. And she was driving a minivan, one of these like hippie type Volkswagen, round vans of the typical 1960s or 70s, yellow. And she was driving one. She was stopping in Careyes just during those few days from Guatemala all the way to San Diego for a big fair where she was going to sell a lot of textiles and silverware. And so one day when she saw me, she asked me, hey, listen, I didn't realize how long the distance is. I'm driving with my 2 sons. Can you please, instead of flying back to Los Angeles, can you drive with me and help me just drive to San Diego, and then you can take a bus to Los Angeles from San Diego, so at least I won't be all alone and I can share the driving with someone. I said, okay. So a week later, I'm in this minivan with these 2 little boys and this older lady who's kind of like a mother, sister figure to me, who's known me since I'm a kid myself. And she had been to India many times. She had already taken initiation or had felt a very strong connection to Babaji, who's a sort of an ethereal figure that Paramahamsa Yogananda mentions a lot in the Kriya Yoga tradition. And so she was in that sort of more yoga, mystic yoga, Advaita Vedanta school of Hinduism. But still, on the dashboard in front of me were pictures of Shiva and Ganesh and her gurus and, incense. And while we're driving, for 6 days, she's telling me about the story of this god and this goddess and how you have to read the autobiography of a yogi and how Babaji once, how, I don't know, Sai Baba once said this and this and that, and Krishna says this and that. And so she basically was the first one who opened the door to the world of quote-unquote Hinduism for me. Up to then, on my own, I had only read, Buddhism, and I had never really had any access to the Sanatan Dharma traditions. We would stop every night, or we'd have lunch or dinner eating guacamole and tortillas, and almost every day we would do a kirtan. And so this was also my first introduction to kirtan. So we would sit under a tree and eat some, like chapatis or tortillas with avocados, and then we would start singing, and then Hare Krishna mantra. We would start singing the Hare Krishna mantra, which these 2 kids knew by heart. And so by the time I got to San Diego, my brain had been like filled with book lists of books I have to read, and an experience of kirtan and a vegetarian diet, and so that's how I got on to buying these different books. I read Autobiography of a Yogi, I read books on Sai Baba, I started practicing some Shaivite meditation techniques. And I remember I was in the south of France that summer, and I was going to maybe go to a music school in the south of France. And I remember I was having lunch in an area where sort of an ancient Roman ruin in the city where Nostradamus was born, actually. That's where this music school was. And I remember,
Which city?
I think it's called Béziers or something. And so I remember I did this meditation technique, and I remember for the first time I had a sort of what we could call is like a a Brahman realization. Like all of a sudden everything around me like started shining, and I could just like literally feel and see Brahman, and that was like that was quite of a mystical experience. Now this little book, Message of Godhead from A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, had stayed with me, and I had taken it as one of the things that I took to France to do this year abroad. at this music school, and then I decided instead to go to the Sorbonne University. Of all the things I could have taken from Los Angeles, that little book was with me, although I had never read it, right? And so come August, I'm in Paris in the little studio on the rooftops of my father's apartment building with the view on the Panthéon and the typical Latin Quarter. And I'm sitting on my bed and I picked that book up, that Prabhupada book. And then I tried to read it again. Again, I couldn't really understand, but I was somewhat fascinated by it. And what really got me is that when I looked at the back, it said ISKCON centers worldwide. Small print of all these different addresses, in different sections of the world: North America, South and Central America, Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia. And I was impressed by how many addresses there were, And then when I looked under France and I saw Paris, there's a number. So I called. It was when ISKCON was in a neighborhood of Paris, on the outskirts of Paris, a place called Noisy-le-Grand. So I called. Fortunately, someone answered. Thank you, Krishna, that someone answered. And the person who answered was Nitai Gaura Sundar, the temple president back then, a French devotee. And I asked him, okay, hi, I got this book, and I'm just calling, and what is this? And he's like, well, this is a temple, and we have monks living here. And but then he said, but actually next week, on September 9th, there's a famous monk, itinerant monk, a sannyasi as we call them, who's coming and who will be in Paris and who will be giving a talk at the cultural center of the Indian embassy, and here's the address, and why don't you come? So I said, okay, fine. So then I made another call. I called my friend Ai Kipman, who was this Vietnamese boy who had been adopted by a Jewish French family, and we were friends. And I said, hey, listen, I'm going to go see this monk who's coming to speak about, philosophy next week. You want to come? He's like, okay. So he and I, the next week go by metro to this center, and we enter this place where there's all these devotees, and most of them are European, and I was like, and as soon as I entered, a disciple, this sannyasi was Bhakti Charuswami, His Holiness Bhakti Charuswami, and one of his disciples from Switzerland, this lady, immediately starts talking to me really nicely in the hall, in the sort of the entrance hall before the actual auditorium. And so she starts telling me about the Vedas, and how the Vedas are this amazing corpus of literatures that encompass everything from medicine to cooking to architecture. And so she kind of painted this very mystifying idea of the Vedas. I always remember this, like, wow, the Vedas, okay, wow, this seems really cool, like this ancient secret books of knowledge that deal with everything. And so then we went to inside the lecture. There was some lady from South Africa who did a Bharatanatyam dance, and then Bhakti Charuswami came on stage, accompanied by a French brahmachari who translated his lecture from English to French. And when Bhakti Charuswami spoke, I was completely mesmerized. First of all, by the way he spoke, by the way he sang those Sanskrit mantras, the Premadvani, or not Premadvani, but the Mangalacharana before, and then the content of what he was talking. The class was called Reincarnation and Beyond. It was just basic Bhagavad Gita 2nd chapter. We're not the body, we're the soul, and then we're reincarnating because of what we have in our minds, and what our actions develop a kind of mindset, and that mindset develops, gets us a different body in the next life. But if we, turn to God from whom we've turned away in the first place, then we don't have to take birth again, and so on. And I was just like, when I was hearing this, I was like, this is it. Like, that's it. I've found what I'm looking for. Like, this is it. Like, I'm not searching anymore. I've found, what is it? Bahunam janmanam ante jnanavan mam prapadyate. So, and what I felt? I like to tell this story. I'll tell you real quick, an analogy how I felt. I'll tell you how I felt afterwards. So, by the end of the lecture, Bhakti Charumar said, okay, now we're going to do a kirtan. Anyone wants to come on stage from the audience? And there were only like 10 or 20 people. It was very, very not poorly attended. But we're going to do a kirtan on stage, calling anyone who wants to come on stage and chant with us, you're welcome. And I really felt like the hand of God was like lifting me from my seat and taking me on stage. I really felt like, I remember I even looked at my friend like, I'm going, and I walked on stage, and so Bhakti Charumar started singing the kirtan, everyone started getting up, and then he was doing call and response, singing the Mahamantra very shortly. And then he was passing on the microphone to different devotees to repeat. And I remember he came up to me and gave me the microphone or pointed it to my mouth, and I didn't even know the Maha Mantra. And I was like, Hare Krishna, Hare. And then he just smiled and gave the microphone on. So that was my first experience. And so after the program, somebody